In a bustling park, a woke woman loudly mocks a man she sees kneeling in prayer, accusing him of clinging to outdated beliefs. Onlookers remain silent, watching the scene unfold. But when the man responds with calm grace, revealing the profound purpose behind his prayers, the woman and everyone else learns a shocking truth that challenges everything they thought they knew about faith, spirituality, and the power of unseen forces. The park buzzed with life on a crisp afternoon. Families gathered near the playground, joggers followed the winding paths, and the steady splash of water from the central fountain provided a soothing backdrop. Amid the hums of activity, a man knelt on the grass a short distance from the fountain, his head bowed in silent prayer. His posture was calm, reverent, a quiet act of devotion amidst the noise. Not everyone saw it that way? A woman dressed in bold, trendy attire stopped mid-stride as she noticed him. Her eyes narrowed and her lips curled into a smirk. "Seriously?" she said loudly, drawing the attention of a few passers-by. "In public? What is this? The Dark Ages?" The man didn't stir, his focus unwavering. The woman placed her hands on her hips and took a step closer. "Hey, I'm talking to you. You can't just kneel here like you're some kind of saint. You know there are people around, right?" Nearby onlookers began to slow, their curiosity piqued. A mother pulling her child along hesitated, her gaze flickering between the woman and the man. A jogger removed an earbud, stopping to watch the scene unfold. The man finally rose to his feet, turning to face the woman. He was middle-aged, with warm, kind eyes and a peaceful demeanor. He clasped his hands in front of him and offered a small smile. "Is there something I can help you with?" he asked gently. Her smirk deepened, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Yeah, you can stop trying to shove your beliefs down everyone's throat. What's next? Are you going to start preaching to us all?" The man tilted his head slightly, his expression calm. "I wasn't trying to disturb anyone. I was just praying." "Exactly," she shot back. "You're making everyone uncomfortable. Keep that stuff at home where it belongs." The man's smile didn't waver. "I'm sorry if it bothered you. That wasn't my intention." A murmur rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. Some exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from discomfort to quiet curiosity. A young man leaned against a tree, his phone out, recording the exchange. The woman scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. "People like you are the problem. You think you're better than everyone else, don't you? Walking around with your holier-than-thou attitude?" The man remained silent for a moment, his gaze steady. "I don't think I'm better than anyone," he said finally. "I'm just a man who believes in the power of prayer. It's how I find peace." "Peace?" she repeated, her voice rising. "What kind of peace do you think you're finding out here, kneeling like that for everyone to see?" The man paused, his eyes scanning the growing crowd. Then he looked back at the woman, his voice calm but firm. "The kind of peace that doesn't depend on what others think." The woman opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. For a moment, she looked unsure, as though his simple statement had struck a chord she hadn't expected. The crowd shifted, whispers breaking out among the onlookers. A man in his 50s muttered, "What's wrong with a little prayer?" while a teenager beside him murmured, "She's really going off on him for no reason." The woman glanced around, sensing the tide turning against her. She crossed her arms and huffed, "Well, I don't see why you have to make it everyone's business." The man took a small step closer, his voice quiet but firm. "I wasn't trying to make it anyone's business. But since you've brought attention to it, maybe there's a reason we're having this conversation." Her brow furrowed, confusion flickering across her face. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Maybe there's something you need to hear," he said, "or something I need to share." The tension in the air thickened, the crowd growing larger as more people stopped to watch. The woman's bravado faltered, but she quickly masked it with a scoff. "Fine," she said. "Let's hear it. Enlighten us all." The man's expression softened, and he gestured for her to sit on a nearby bench. "I'll tell you," he said, "but it's not just for you, it's for everyone here." As the woman hesitated, the crowd pressed closer, their curiosity piqued. The man's calm demeanor and quiet strength had captured their attention, and they sensed that whatever he was about to say would challenge their assumptions in ways they hadn't anticipated. The woman hesitated for a moment, glancing nervously at the crowd gathering around her and the man she had just berated. The tension in the air was palpable, but the man stood steady, his expression calm. Finally, she rolled her eyes and plopped down on the bench he had gestured to, crossing her legs and folding her arms defensively. "All right," she said, her voice laced with sarcasm. "Let's hear this life-changing revelation of yours." The man sat down across from her, his movements deliberate and peaceful. His hands rested in his lap, his posture unthreatening yet composed. "I'm not here to change your life," he said gently. "That's not something I can do. But maybe I can offer you something to think about." The crowd, now numbering a dozen or so, stood quietly around them, their curiosity growing. Among them, a mother held her child's hand, a young couple exchanged whispers, and an elderly man leaned on his cane, his eyes narrowing with interest. The man turned his gaze back to the woman, who was still sitting with a look of defiance. "You asked why I pray," he began, "and why I do it in public. The truth is, prayer has always been my way of finding peace, especially in the chaos of life." "Peace?" she interrupted, her tone sharp. "Kneeling in the middle of a park doesn't sound very peaceful to me." He smiled faintly. "It might not seem that way to you, but peace isn't about where you are or what's happening around you. It's about what's happening inside you." The woman blinked, her expression faltering for just a moment, but she quickly regained her composure, scoffing. "That sounds nice and all, but it doesn't change the fact that you're making a spectacle of yourself." The man tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. "Do you think I wanted a crowd?" he asked. "I wasn't trying to draw attention. I was simply doing what I've always done, connecting with something greater than myself." The woman hesitated, her sharp demeanor softening just a little. "So what exactly were you praying for?" The man's face grew thoughtful. "For clarity," he said simply. "For the strength to continue on the path I've been called to walk, and for anyone who's lost or struggling to find their own way." The crowd murmured softly, the sincerity in his voice resonating with many of them. A young man in a hoodie spoke up from the edge of the group. "Why do you think prayer helps?" he asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. The man turned toward him, his expression kind. "Because it reminds me that I'm not alone," he replied. "In a world that's so often divided and chaotic, prayer connects me to something constant and unchanging. It's not about asking for miracles. It's about grounding myself in faith, even when life feels overwhelming." The young man nodded slowly, his skepticism giving way to curiosity. Meanwhile, the woman on the bench fidgeted, her posture growing less rigid. She looked at the man, her brow furrowed. "You really believe that, don't you?" she asked, her tone softer now. "I do," he said firmly. "But I don't expect you to believe it just because I do. Faith isn't something you force on others. It's something you live out, day by day." The crowd shifted again, some nodding in agreement while others exchanged thoughtful glances. The tension that had hung in the air earlier began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of quiet reflection. The woman uncrossed her arms, her gaze falling to the ground. "I don't get it," she admitted after a moment. "I've never believed in anything like that. It's just not who I am." "That's okay," the man said, his tone warm and understanding. "Faith isn't about being perfect or having all the answers. It's about being open to the idea that there's more to life than what we can see or understand." For the first time, the woman seemed to consider his words, her guarded expression softening. The crowd, too, stood a little closer, their attention fully on the man who had turned a moment of conflict into an opportunity for connection. "Maybe," the woman said quietly, "but it still feels strange." "Sometimes the things that feel strange are the ones that matter most," the man said, "and sometimes they're the ones that change us in ways we never expected." The woman didn't respond, but her silence spoke volumes. Around them, the crowd watched intently, sensing that this moment was far from over, and that it might just lead to something extraordinary. The woman shifted on the bench, her defiance giving way to an awkward uncertainty. The man's calm demeanor and steady responses had disarmed her, leaving her without the sharp retort she had relied on moments earlier. The crowd, still lingering nearby, listened in silence, captivated by the unexpected turn of events. The woman crossed her arms again, but this time, it felt less like a defense and more like a shield against something deeper. "So, what's your story?" she asked. "Why does prayer mean so much to you?" The man smiled faintly, his gaze dropping to his hands. For a moment, he seemed to retreat into himself, as though weighing how much to share. Finally, he looked up, his eyes warm but heavy with memory. "I didn't grow up praying," he began. "In fact, I didn't believe in much of anything for a long time. I thought I had all the answers, that I could handle anything life threw at me on my own. But then, life taught me otherwise." He paused and the crowd leaned in, the hum of the park fading into the background. Even the woman seemed drawn in, her earlier skepticism replaced by a quiet curiosity. "I lost everything I thought I cared about," he continued. "A business I worked years to build, friends I thought would always be there, and someone I loved deeply." His voice caught for a moment, and he took a deep breath before continuing. "It was like the ground had been ripped out from under me and I was falling with no way to stop." The woman's arms dropped to her sides, her expression softening. "What happened?" she asked, her voice uncharacteristically gentle. "I hit rock bottom," he said, simply. "And when I did, I realized something important. I couldn't do it alone. That's when I started to pray. Not because I knew how or even believed it would help, but because I didn't have anywhere else to turn." The woman frowned, her brow furrowing. "And it helped? Just like that?" The man chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Not just like that. Prayer didn't magically fix everything. But it gave me something I hadn't had in a long time. Hope. It reminded me that I wasn't alone, even in my darkest moments." The crowd murmured quietly, the weight of his words sinking in. A middle-aged man near the back nodded, his face thoughtful. "I've been there," he said quietly, his voice carrying in the stillness. "I know what that feels like." The man smiled at him, a sense of camaraderie passing between them. He turned back to the woman, who now seemed far less certain of her earlier stance. "Prayer isn't about having all the answers," he said. "It's about trusting that even when we don't understand, there's a purpose to the struggles we face." The woman's gaze dropped to the ground, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve. "I don't know if I believe in that," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's okay," the man said gently. "Faith doesn't start with certainty. It starts with being open to the possibility that there's more to life than what we see." The woman didn't respond, but her posture softened, her earlier sharpness replaced by quiet introspection. The crowd, too, seemed to relax, their initial curiosity deepening into respect for the man who had turned a confrontation into a moment of vulnerability and connection. As the man fell silent, a young woman in the crowd stepped forward, her voice tentative. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "How do you keep believing? When things get hard, I mean." The man met her gaze, his expression kind. "Because I've seen what happens when I don't," he said simply. "And because every time I've prayed, Every single time, I've found the strength to keep going. Not because the problems disappeared, but because I knew I wasn't facing them alone. The young woman nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. The crowd shifted again, their attention lingering on the man who had so effortlessly drawn them into his story. The woman on the bench glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "You really believe all that, don't you?" she asked. "I do," he said firmly. "And I think, deep down, we all want to believe in something greater than ourselves. We just have to be willing to take that first step." The woman looked away, her thoughts clearly racing. The crowd stood in hushed anticipation, sensing that this encounter was far from over, and that the man's story had only just begun. The woman sat motionless on the bench, her earlier confidence visibly crumbling under the weight of the man's words. Her sharp retorts were replaced by a troubled silence, and her gaze drifted across the park, avoiding his steady, compassionate eyes. The crowd around them remained quiet and attentive, as if sensing something profound was about to unfold. "You talk like you've got it all figured out," she said finally, her voice quieter now, almost fragile. "Like faith fixes everything." The man shook his head gently. "Faith doesn't fix everything," he replied. "It doesn't erase pain or make life easier, but it gives you the strength to face it, to keep going, even when it feels impossible." The woman scoffed, but there was no conviction behind it. "Strength," she muttered almost to herself. "Yeah, I've heard that before." The man studied her carefully, his expression softening. "You don't believe it," he said gently. "Why?" Her head snapped up, and for a moment anger flickered in her eyes, but it wasn't the righteous indignation of before. It was something deeper, something raw. "Because I've tried," she said, her voice shaking. "I've tried to believe in something bigger, something better. And it never made a difference." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, the weight of her words hanging in the air. The man didn't flinch, his calm demeanor unwavering. "What happened?" he asked quietly. The woman hesitated, her fingers twisting in her lap. "Life happened," she said bitterly. "I lost my job, my partner walked out on me, and my mom got sick, all in the same year. I prayed, just like everyone said I should. I begged for something, anything to get better. And do you know what happened? Nothing. Absolutely nothing." The man nodded slowly, his eyes filled with understanding. "That's a heavy burden to carry," he said, "and I'm sorry you had to face all of that." She laughed bitterly, the sound sharp and hollow. "You're sorry? What good does that do? Sorry doesn't change anything. Sorry doesn't bring back what I lost." "No, it doesn't," he agreed. "But sometimes the things we lose make space for something new, something we couldn't see before." The woman's laughter faded, replaced by a scowl. "That's easy for you to say. You don't know what it's like to feel completely abandoned, to lose everything and have no one to turn to." The man's expression grew somber. "You're right," he said. "I don't know your exact pain, but I do know what it feels like to be lost, to feel like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. And I know how hard it is to let go of that pain." The woman's defiance cracked further, her eyes glistening as she stared at the ground. "I don't know how to let go," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know where to start." "By taking one step," the man said softly. "Just one. You don't have to have all the answers. You don't even have to believe completely. But if you take that first step, whether it's praying, talking to someone who'd say, or just admitting you need help, it can change everything." The woman looked up at him, her face a mix of doubt and longing. "And what if it doesn't work?" she asked. "Then you take another step," he said. "And another. until one day you realize you're not carrying that weight alone anymore. The crowd remained silent, their eyes fixed on the woman as she struggled with her emotions. A young mother in the crowd wiped away a tear, and the older man with the cane nodded knowingly, his face filled with empathy. The woman exhaled shakily, her hands trembling in her lap. "I don't know if I can do it," she said. "You can," the man said firmly, "because you've already started. Sitting here, talking about it. That's your first step." She looked at him, her guarded expression softening. For the first time, her anger seemed to dissolve, replaced by something quieter, something closer to hope. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice steady but hesitant. The man smiled, a warm, genuine smile that seemed to ease the tension in the air. "That's all I'm asking," he said. "Just think about it." As the crowd watched, a subtle shift seemed to take place, not just in the woman, but in everyone who had witnessed the exchange. The man's quiet wisdom and unwavering faith had sparked something, a reminder of the strength that comes from facing life's struggles with grace and humility. The woman rose from the bench, her movements slow and deliberate. "Thanks," she muttered, her tone awkward but sincere. "I guess I needed to hear that." The man nodded. "We all need reminders sometimes," he said. She walked away, her head bowed, leaving the crowd to absorb the moment. The man remained seated, his hands folded in his lap, his expression peaceful. Around him, the park was silent, the onlookers moved by what they had just witnessed. The crowd lingered even after the woman had walked away, their expressions reflecting a mixture of awe and introspection. The man, still seated on the bench, exhaled deeply, his calm demeanor unchanged. For him, the moment wasn't about triumph, it was about connection. A teenager stepped forward, nervously clutching his phone. "Excuse me," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "That was amazing. How did you stay so calm when she was yelling at you?" The man looked up, offering a gentle smile. "Grace," he said simply. The boy frowned, confused. "Grace? Like, being polite?" "Not just that," the man replied. "Grace is the ability to respond with love and understanding, even when someone is being unkind. It's not about winning an argument, it's about showing compassion." Another voice chimed in, this time from an older woman near the back of the crowd. "But isn't it hard?" she asked. "When someone is so rude or disrespectful?" The man nodded. "It's incredibly hard. But grace isn't about the other person, it's about you. It's about refusing to let someone else's anger or pain dictate your actions, and it's about recognizing that their words often come from a place of hurt, even if they don't realize it." The crowd murmured, the man's words resonating deeply with many. A young mother holding a toddler on her hip stepped closer. "I wish I could do that," she said. "But when someone insults me or my family, I get so angry. I don't know how to stop myself." The man's gaze softened. "Anger is natural," he said. "It's a human response to feeling attacked or wronged. But grace comes when you choose not to let that anger control you. It's not about suppressing your feelings, it's about channeling them into something better." The mother tilted her head, her brow furrowing. "How do you do that?" "By remembering that we're all carrying something," he said. "Pain, fear, regret. It's different for everyone, but it's always there. When you see someone through the lens of grace, you start to understand that their words or actions often have nothing to do with you and everything to do with what they're going through." The teenager from earlier spoke up again, his curiosity undiminished. "But doesn't it ever feel unfair? Like, why should you have to be the bigger person all the time?" The man chuckled softly, nodding. "It does feel unfair sometimes, but grace isn't about fairness, it's about freedom. When you choose grace, you free yourself from the burden of resentment and anger. You let go of the need to retaliate, and in doing so, you find peace." The boy nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. Around them, the crowd grew more engaged, asking questions and sharing their own experiences. It was as if the man's calm presence had created a safe space for vulnerability and reflection. A middle-aged man stepped forward, his voice hesitant. "I've been angry at my brother for years," he admitted. "We had a falling out over something stupid, and neither of us wants to back down. Hearing you talk about grace, it makes me wonder if I should be the one to reach out first." The man on the bench looked up at him, his eyes filled with kindness. "Grace isn't about who's right or wrong," he said. "It's about what matters most. If your relationship with your brother is more important than the argument, then yes, be the one to take that first step. It might just change everything." The middle-aged man nodded, his face a mixture of relief and determination. "Thank you," he said quietly. The crowd began to shift, their initial curiosity transforming into something deeper. Conversations broke out among small groups, each person sharing their own stories of conflict, regret, and hope. The man watched quietly, his heart full as he saw the ripple effect of his words. Finally, the young mother from earlier approached him again, her toddler now asleep in her arms. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said. "You've given me a lot to think about." The man smiled. "It's not about me," he said. "It's about the choices we all make every day. Grace is always an option. It's just up to us whether we choose it." As the crowd began to disperse, the park seemed lighter, as if the weight of the earlier confrontation had been replaced by something hopeful. The man remained on the bench, his hands folded in his lap, his expression serene. For those who had witnessed the exchange, it wasn't just an ordinary day at the park anymore. It was a moment of clarity, a reminder that even in the face of anger and misunderstanding, there was always room for grace. The energy in the park had changed. What began as a confrontation had evolved into something deeper, something that touched the hearts of those who lingered. People who had merely been bystanders now found themselves reflecting on their own lives, inspired by the man's calm wisdom and the power of his grace. A young woman, who had been sitting on a nearby bench scrolling through her phone, stood and approached the man. She looked nervous, her hands twisting the strap of her purse. "I've never prayed," she admitted, her voice hesitant. "I've always thought it was pointless, but listening to you today, it made me wonder. How do you even start?" The man's face softened with understanding. "Prayer doesn't have to be complicated," he said. "It's not about saying the perfect words or following a specific formula. It's about being honest, opening your heart to something greater and speaking from where you are." The young woman nodded slowly, as if turning the idea over in her mind. "What if I don't believe in anything? Does it even work if you're not sure?" The man smiled gently. "Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about being willing to ask the questions. Doubt and faith can coexist, and often the act of praying is what helps us discover what we truly believe." Nearby, an older man with a cane cleared his throat, stepping forward. His voice was deep and steady. "I've prayed my whole life," he said. "And I can tell you this. It's not about getting what you want. It's about finding the strength to face what comes." The young woman looked at him, her eyes wide. "Did it help you?" He nodded, his weathered face etched with wisdom. "More times than I can count. Prayer doesn't change the world around you. It changes you. It gives you the courage to keep going, no matter what." The crowd murmured in agreement, their conversations weaving together in a tapestry of shared experiences. A mother spoke of the comfort prayer had brought her during her child's illness. A teenager admitted that it helped him feel less alone during his parents' divorce. Even those who didn't pray began to share moments of resilience and hope, recognizing the common thread that united them all. The man on the bench listened, his heart full as he watched the connections forming around him. He had prayed for clarity that morning, for strength to walk the path set before him. Now he saw the answer unfolding in real time. not as a grand miracle, but as a series of small, meaningful moments. A man in a suit who had been standing at the back of the crowd stepped forward. His tone was skeptical but curious. "I'm not religious," he said bluntly, "but I have to admit, what you've said today makes me wonder, how do you know this isn't just wishful thinking?" The man met his gaze, his expression calm. "I don't know," he admitted. "Faith isn't about certainty. It's about trust. I can't prove that my prayers are heard or that they make a difference, but I can tell you what I've experienced, and that's enough for me." The man in the suit frowned thoughtfully, as though wrestling with the idea. "I guess that makes sense," he said finally. The man on the bench nodded. "Faith is personal. It's not something you can force or fake, but when you're ready, you might find that it's been waiting for you all along." The conversations around them grew louder, more animated, as the crowd began to share their own thoughts and stories. What had started as a tense confrontation now felt like a community coming together, united by a desire to understand and support one another. The young woman who had approached the man earlier looked at him again, her expression soft. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I think I'll try it. Praying, I mean, even if I don't know what I'm doing." The man smiled. "That's all it takes," he said. "Just start." As the crowd gradually began to disperse, the man remained seated, watching the park return to its usual rhythm. Children laughed on the playground, couples strolled hand in hand, and joggers passed by, earbuds in place. But something had shifted, a ripple of grace and understanding that lingered long after the moment had passed. For those who had stayed to listen, the man's words weren't just about prayer or faith. They were about humanity, about the courage to face life's challenges with humility, compassion, and an open heart. And as they walked away, each person carried a piece of that message with them, a quiet reminder of the power of grace to transform not just moments, but lives. As the last of the crowd drifted away, the man remained seated on the bench, his gaze fixed on the fountain. His calm presence, which had so thoroughly captivated the park's visitors, now seemed to hold a quiet depth, as though he were processing the moment himself. Sarah, the young mother who had spoken earlier, lingered nearby. Her curiosity about the man's story had only grown. Summoning her courage, she stepped forward once more. "I know you've already shared so much today," she began hesitantly. "But I can't stop wondering. Why were you praying this morning? Was it for something specific?" The man looked up at her, his expression thoughtful. For a moment he seemed to weigh her question, then nodded. "Yes," he said. "It was for something very specific." He gestured to the spot on the ground where he had knelt earlier, his voice soft but steady. "I was praying for clarity," he said, "for the strength to follow through on something I've been called to do." Sarah tilted her head, her curiosity deepening. "What do you mean by called?" she asked. The man smiled faintly. "Sometimes life presents us with a purpose, a path we didn't expect but can't ignore. For me, that purpose has been to share what I've learned about grace, faith, and forgiveness. But today I was praying for something more immediate, for the courage to speak to someone who's been on my heart for a long time." Sarah's brows furrowed. "Someone specific?" He nodded again, his gaze distant. "A friend. Someone I hurt deeply many years ago. I've carried that regret with me for so long, and I know it's time to make amends. But taking that step, it's not easy." The weight of his words hung in the air, and Sarah felt a pang of understanding. "That sounds really hard," she said. "But it's also brave." The man's smile grew a little wider. "Bravery doesn't mean you're not afraid," he said. "It means you move forward despite the fear." Nearby, the elderly man with the cane, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "You're right," he said, his voice steady. "I spent years avoiding my own brother because of a fight we had. By the time I was ready to make peace, it was too late. If you have the chance to make things right, take it." The man nodded, his gratitude evident. "Thank you," he said. "Your words mean more than you know." Sarah glanced at the elderly man, then back at the man on the bench. "So, are you going to do it? Reach out to your friend?" The man exhaled deeply, his gaze unwavering. "Yes," he said. "Today. After this." Sarah's eyes widened slightly. "That's incredible. I don't think I've ever met someone with as much courage as you." He chuckled softly. "It's not courage," he said. "It's faith. I've prayed for this moment, and now it's here. It's not about whether I feel ready. It's about trusting that it's the right thing to do." The young woman from earlier, who had returned quietly to the edge of the scene, spoke up. "What if they don't forgive you?" she asked. "What if it doesn't go the way you hope?" The man looked at her, his eyes filled with quiet certainty. "Then I'll accept that," he said. "Because grace isn't about the outcome. It's about the effort. Even if they can't forgive me, I'll know I've done my part to make amends." His words struck a chord, and the small group around him fell silent, each person lost in their own thoughts. For Sarah, the man's revelation was more than just a story. It was a reminder of the power of humility and the strength it took to confront one's past. As the man stood to leave, the people around him instinctively stepped back, as though they understood the significance of his next steps. Sarah watched him go, a newfound sense of purpose stirring in her chest. If he could face his fears and seek forgiveness, perhaps she could find the strength to do the same in her own life. The park, once filled with tension and division, now felt like a sanctuary, a place where vulnerability and connection had taken root. And for those who had witnessed the moment, the man's quiet courage left an indelible mark, a reminder that even the smallest acts of faith could ripple outward in ways they could never predict. The woman who had stormed away earlier didn't go far. She found a bench at the edge of the park, her mind racing. The man's words echoed in her thoughts, unsettling her in ways she hadn't anticipated. For so long, she had buried her pain beneath layers of anger and sarcasm, but today, something had shifted. She pulled her phone from her pocket, scrolling aimlessly as if searching for a distraction. Instead, she stumbled upon a video of the interaction. Someone had posted it online. The clip was already gaining traction, the comments filled with words of support for the man and sharp criticism of her. She winced, reading phrases like "grace under fire" and "the power of kindness" juxtaposed with "what's wrong with people these days." Her fingers hovered over the screen, her heart sinking. The version of herself she saw in the video wasn't the confident, empowered person she had always imagined. Instead, she saw someone bitter and small, lashing out without cause. The man, on the other hand, radiated calm strength, a stark contrast that left her feeling exposed. Tears pricked her eyes as she closed the app and stared at the fountain in the distance. Why had his words affected her so deeply, she wondered. Why couldn't she just let it go? The sound of footsteps broke her reverie. She looked up to see the man approaching, his expression kind but unreadable. For a moment, she considered walking away, but something in his demeanor stopped her. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. She hesitated, then shrugged. "It's a free park." He sat down, leaving a respectful distance between them. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence was almost unbearable, and she finally blurted out, "I don't get you." He turned to her, his gaze steady. "What don't you get?" "Why you didn't fight back," she said, her voice trembling with frustration. "Why you didn't get angry. I was awful to you. You had every right to yell at me, but you didn't. Why?" He smiled faintly. "Because anger doesn't solve anything. You weren't attacking me. You were expressing your own pain. I saw that." Her eyes widened, his words striking a nerve she didn't know was there. "Pain?" she echoed. "What do you mean?" He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "When people lash out, it's often because they're carrying something heavy. Hurt, fear, regret. It can weigh on us until it spills over. I don't know what you're carrying, but I saw it in your eyes, and I knew that anger wouldn't help you." Her defenses crumbled further and she looked away, tears slipping down her cheeks. "You don't know anything about me," she whispered. "No," he admitted. "But I know what it feels like to carry pain. And I know how much it can help to let it out. To talk to someone who will listen." She hesitated, her instinct to push him away warring with the sudden, overwhelming desire to be heard. "I've made so many mistakes," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "Hurt people who didn't deserve it. Lost people I can't get back." The man nodded, his expression full of understanding. "We all have," he said. "But mistakes don't define you. What matters is what you choose to do next." She turned to him, her eyes searching his face. "How do you forgive yourself for all the things you've done wrong?" "It starts with grace," he said. "The same grace you offer others, you have to offer yourself. It's not easy, but it's the only way to move forward." She swallowed hard, his words cutting through her self-loathing like a balm. "I don't even know where to start," she admitted. He smiled, his eyes warm. "You just did." For the first time, she felt a flicker of hope, a tiny, fragile thing, but enough to hold on to. She wiped her tears and sat up straighter, her breath coming easier. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for not giving up on me." He shook his head. "It's not about giving up or holding on. It's about seeing people for who they are, not just how they act in a single moment." As they sat together, the fountain splashing in the distance, the woman felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The man had shown her something she hadn't thought possible, the power of grace to heal even the deepest wounds. The woman left the park that day feeling lighter, though uncertain about what came next. Her conversation with the man had sparked something inside her, a fragile yet undeniable desire to change. As she walked home, her thoughts churned. Could she really forgive herself? Could she face the people she had hurt and make things right? Meanwhile, the park returned to its usual hum of activity. The man, still seated on the bench, noticed the lingering glances of passers-by who had witnessed the earlier confrontation. Some approached him. Others simply nodded in acknowledgement, their expressions a mix of admiration and gratitude. The man smiled humbly, recognizing the seeds of change planted in those brief encounters. Later that evening, a video of the confrontation began circulating widely online. It wasn't just the clash that caught people's attention, it was the man's calm, measured response. His grace under fire, his refusal to retaliate, and his willingness to engage with compassion resonated deeply with viewers. Comments poured in. "This man is the embodiment of grace. We need more people like him in the world." "I've been struggling with my own anger lately. Watching this reminded me of the power of kindness." His words about prayer and connection hit me hard. "I'm not religious, but maybe I should try to find something like that." The video sparked conversations far beyond the park. Families watched together, sharing their own experiences with forgiveness and faith. Teachers played it in classrooms to discuss empathy and conflict resolution. Churches and community groups used it as a teaching tool, encouraging discussions about grace and understanding. The woman from the park, scrolling through social media, stumbled across the video. Seeing herself through the lens of others was humbling. The comments about her behavior stung, but they also fueled her determination to grow. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope that change was possible. The next morning, she wrote a letter to her estranged sister, a relationship she had severed years ago during a heated argument. In the letter, she apologized sincerely, acknowledging her faults and expressing her desire to reconcile. She didn't know if her sister would respond, but for the first time she felt at peace knowing she had taken the first step. Elsewhere, people who had witnessed the exchange began sharing their own stories of transformation. The teenager who had asked the man about anger reached out to an old friend he had wronged, seeking forgiveness. The mother who had spoken of her struggles with patience decided to pray for the first time in years, finding a sense of calm she hadn't felt in ages. Even those who had only seen the video found themselves inspired. A businessman wrote a heartfelt email to a colleague he had unfairly blamed for a mistake. A college student decided to volunteer at a local food bank after being moved by the man's message about purpose and connection. The ripple effect was undeniable, spreading far beyond the park and touching lives in ways the man could never have anticipated. At the center of it all, the man remained unchanged. He continued his daily routines, praying in the park and offering quiet encouragement to those who stopped to speak with him. For him, the attention wasn't the point. What mattered was the hope and healing that had grown from a moment of conflict. When asked about the impact of his actions, he would simply smile and say, "It wasn't me. It was grace. All I did was make room for it." For the woman, the man's words became a guiding light. She began attending a local support group, sharing her story, and listening to others. Slowly but surely, she started to rebuild her life. Not through grand gestures, but through small, deliberate acts of kindness and accountability. The confrontation that had once felt like the worst moment of her life now seemed like a turning point. It wasn't easy and it wasn't instant, but with each step, she felt herself moving closer to the person she wanted to be. And for everyone touched by the man's example, the lesson was clear. Grace wasn't just a gift to be received, it was a gift to be shared. Weeks after the encounter at the park, life began to settle into a new rhythm for those who had been touched by the moment. The man continued his quiet practice of prayer and reflection, often returning to the same spot by the fountain. While he remained humble and unassuming, the ripple effect of his actions had grown far beyond what he could have imagined. For the woman, the experience marked the beginning of a profound transformation. She reached out to her sister again, this time receiving a cautious but hopeful response. Their first meeting was tentative, filled with awkward silences and emotional apologies, but it was a start. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of hope, proof that rebuilding wasn't just possible, but worth the effort. She also began to examine the anger that had defined so much of her life. Inspired by the man's words about grace, she started journaling, reflecting on the pain and insecurities that had fueled her harshness. Over time, the act of writing helped her find clarity, allowing her to see herself and her actions more clearly. While the process wasn't easy, it was deeply freeing. The video of the park encounter continued to gain traction, drawing attention from people across the world. News outlets reached out to the man, eager to feature his story, but he declined most interviews, preferring to let his actions speak for themselves. "It's not about me," he explained to those who asked. "It's about the message." And the message resonated. Churches and community groups organized events to discuss the power of grace and forgiveness, using the man's story as a starting point. Schools incorporated it into lessons on empathy, sparking conversations among students about the importance of kindness and understanding. Social media lit up with hashtags like Grace in Action and Choose Kindness, with people sharing their own stories of transformation. For Sarah, the young mother, the encounter at the park became a turning point in her relationship with her husband. Inspired by the man's words, she apologized for the times she had let stress get the better of her and committed to being more patient and present. Her husband, moved by her vulnerability, responded with his own apology, and together they began rebuilding their connection. Even the teenager who had questioned the man found himself changed. After reaching out to his estranged friend, he decided to take a more active role in his community, volunteering at a local youth center to help kids struggling with anger and isolation. "I used to think grace was weakness," he admitted to a mentor, "but now I see it's the strongest thing you can do." As the days turned into months, the park became a quiet symbol of transformation for those who had been there that day. People returned, not just to pray or reflect, but to connect with one another. The fountain, once just a backdrop, now felt like a meeting place, a reminder of the power of small moments to spark big changes. The man, ever humble, continued to pray in his quiet way, never seeking recognition for what had unfolded. For him, the encounter wasn't about fame or accolades. It was about living his faith authentically and sharing it with others in a way that resonated. When asked by a passerby if he ever felt the pressure to live up to the hero label others had given him, he simply smiled and said, "I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who believes in the power of grace, and I hope that belief inspires others to find their own path." For the woman, his words became a mantra as she navigated her own journey. Each step forward, whether reconnecting with her sister, forgiving herself, or showing kindness to strangers, felt like a tribute to the man who had shown her that change was possible. In the end, the story wasn't just about one man's faith or one woman's transformation. It was about the collective impact of grace, the way it could ripple outward, touching lives and inspiring change in ways no one could predict. And as the man knelt in prayer by the fountain one crisp morning, a small crowd began to gather, not out of curiosity or conflict, but out of gratitude. Together, they stood in quiet solidarity, a testament to the power of grace to heal, unite, and transform.